Hi guys, welcome to the archive. Well, I'm officially working in a coronavirus lockdown, though thankfully myself, my family and friends are safe and well, and hopefully all of yours are too. I'm not going to ramble about it too much because I'm sure you've heard plenty about it in your day-to-day lives, so I'll stick to the reason you're probably here, which will probably be the modular wood construction system. If you've seen any of my previous builds, you'll probably know that I have a goal with them, to be as modular as possible. I've also sprinkled a few ideas throughout about ways to make things either faster or cheaper, and as always you can make as much or as little of this as you want. A lot of the accessories actually make fun little scatter terrain projects in their own right when you have a spare hour or so lying around. A simple version of this build can be put together in a few evenings, so even the most time-starved can get something out of this tutorial. Well, that's the aim anyway. So why did I design this system? Well, it was partially for myself. I started planning it a little while ago, but also partially because I see a lot of people wanting Dwarven Forge style terrain where you've got pieces that you can turn into buildings, but Dwarven Forge is expensive. So I decided to make some. This entire build is designed to be more affordable than purchased dungeon tile kits like Dwarven Forge, while maintaining that awesome atmosphere that we all like to drool at in the photos of them. This is not to say that Dwarven Forge is bad, far from it. It's an amazing option from people who are incredibly time-starved but have the money to pay for it. Unfortunately for a lot of us, myself included, it's a little out of reach. In this video I'll be going through how the system works, how to get some better results from wood grain and XPS foam, how to actually build these pieces, and finally how to put them together in different builds, including exactly how many pieces you will need for some of the builds that I've shown here. I will try to timestamp all of these in a pinned comment so you can bounce backwards and forwards as you want to, and so you can come back to things when you have the time to do them. The system has a range of advantages, not least of which is its sheer flexibility. It can be used to represent indoor spaces, but can also be used to represent buildings. It's easily packed away, so you don't have to create loads of individual buildings for taverns, stables, inns, blacksmiths, and so on. You can just use tiles from this system to represent those buildings and then pack them away afterwards. Also means you don't have to store lots of different buildings. So obviously I'll be expanding on the system a little bit more in future, but this video should give you a good idea of where I'm headed with it. Just so you guys know, as you can see, this video is a very large and detailed one. It took about a month to put together and will mean I won't be able to put out a video each week, as when I do, they're a lot more detailed. This saves a ton of time, which I've been able to use to add more tutorials to this video, things that I wouldn't have had time for if I was doing 4 smaller videos. If you do like this longer format, I really need you guys to show it by watching for as long as you can. I'd love to do more detailed videos like this, but I can only really do them if I see enough watch time on the video, or the channel might not be shown to as many people, which is kind of important. The core of the system is based around tiles, walls and columns, all of which can be connected using only card and cocktail sticks at the top, bottom and sides. In future I'm aiming to magnetize the system, but I'll always be making sure that anything I do with magnets can be replicated with just basic cheap cocktail sticks. The system also includes a technique for thin interior walls between tiles, which I've used for the fences for now, but which I'll be expanding on greatly in future. Finally, the core pieces are topped off by the roof system, which I'll also be expanding later to allow for larger roofs for larger buildings. Think like a Saxon longhouse or Edoras from Lord of the Rings, which is based on Saxon longhouses. For now, the roof system is made up of side walls and roof pieces that slot into them, which can be sealed at the back by walls or can rest up against more roof pieces sloping down the other way. And of course, there are also accessories, both ones that you can just place down, as well as more wall-mounted ones taking advantage of the wall mounting system from my previous videos. Before we get started, I've put together a short section on some of the tricks I've picked up to get a better wood grain effect from XPS foam. This is somewhat relevant even if you don't use the wire brush method and use the pencil method instead, but is particularly important for getting a great result with the wire brush method. Now XPS foam does seem to have a grain running through it. However, this does, in my experiments at least, seem to be a surface level grain that is developed when the piece is cut on a hot wire table or something similar. If you cut the piece in different directions, it's possible for the grain to be going in completely different directions on different edges of the foam. When you're cutting, aim to have the grains on the large faces running in the same direction. so aim to always cut the piece in the same direction regardless of which side that you are cutting. It's also useful to match up the grains on the thin edges with the grains on the large face where possible, so that they face the same direction. This all helps with the illusion that this is the same piece of wood on each side. It's also important to mention that I found XPS foam to have a hard edge on its large faces, probably where it was cut at a high temperature by an industrial scale wire cutter. This hard edge is fantastically receptive to stone texturing, better than any edges that you cut. However, it's also less great for wood grain as it's harder to get a smooth effect. Again, this is something you can ignore, but bearing it in mind can get you a better result. I tend to make sure that I trim this hard edge off when I'm working with a piece that I want to have wood grain, which is easy enough to do for the walls as they need a little bit of trimming anyway, and for the floors I use the hard edge as the bottom. This is harder to do if you use 1/2 inch foam, at least for the floors. It is, however, why I like to keep both thicknesses lying around. They're both great for different things, and it's not like they have a use-by date. The easiest thing to do is to cut lots of 3 inch by 3 inch by 1/2 inch tiles. I used a mid-temperature setting somewhere between 3 and 4 on my Proxon, and then work from there. This obviously starts you with 3 inch by 3 inch 1/2 inch tiles for the floors, but also sets you up to cut them down to various sizes for different purposes, while keeping that wood grain the way you want it. For example, you could cut one 3 inch by 3 inch piece to a 1/4 inch thick, thereby slicing off the hard edges of the foam if you have them, and giving you a cut-off piece that you can then use for planks, which I'll mention in a second. Once cut down to a 1/4 inch thick, you can cut the pieces across the grain, so that the grain runs down the 2 inch short edge. This works well for walls, as the wood planks will be running vertical, and you end up with a 2 inch piece and a 1 inch piece, which is perfect for a wall and even leaving the perfect amount left to make a half wall if you wanted to make one. You could then take the cut-offs and cut the tile along the grain into 1/4 inch strips and 1/2 inch strips, which you can then cut down a little bit further to be 1/8 of an inch thick. Something I realised while making this project is that it'd be a lot easier to texture these cut-offs on one side, including any cutting and beveling of the line in the middle of the 1/2 inch planks, and then cut them. That saves a lot of fiddling later. If you want measurements for the 1/2 inch beveling, I started a 1/4 inch from the edge of the foam and then beveled lines every 1/2 inch from there. These pieces make fantastic wood planks to place damn near anywhere. I ended up making more than I'll likely need for this project, so I have some lying around to add to future projects. You should only need 2 1/2 inch planks and 2 1/4 inch planks per wall, as well as 2 1/4 inch strips per ceiling edge. Either way, the important thing is keeping the grain the way that you want it. This isn't essential, you can do it without keeping this in mind, but thinking about it will get you a better wood grain effect later on, whether you use a wire brush or the pencil method. Before I start, if you feel you have limited hobby time, I've included a little section at the end of each tutorial section that says different ways you can make each piece a little bit faster. So take a look at those before you decide whether or not you have the time to build a project like this, because you can make it an awful lot faster if that is something you need to do. You might notice that these floor tiles look a lot like the floor tiles created by Blackmagic Craft, and you'd be right. There's 2 reasons I chose this design to use within this system. 1, it's good. It looks good in a remarkable variety of situations. It neither looks too rich or too noble, nor too poor, evil or downtrodden to work as a modular piece in a ton of different scenarios. It also has a nice little feature in that it has a subtle grid installed. Now, I don't personally use a grid, but a lot of people do, so I thought I would include it for everyone. The final reason I decided to use tiles that were based on Blackmagic Craft's own were because, let's face it, Blackmagic Craft is popular in the community, a lot of people may already have these tiles, and it's going to be a lot easier for them to modify those tiles with the connection system underneath than it would be to create a bunch of new tiles afresh. This saves those people a bunch of time, foam, effort, money, you name it. If you do need to make them fresh, start with one 3 inch by 3 inch by 1/2 inch piece of foam. Cut 1/2 inch planks in the direction of the grain, including down the side. Alternatively, you can use a hot wire table and cut the lines in like an assembly line, doing the same half-inch increment on each piece at the same time, using the lowest temperature. I made mine look like thick beams. An alternative is to cut a line about 1/8 of an inch from the top of the tile all the way around the edges, and only continue the plank lines down to that point. This will make the edges look more like decking, and is what Blackmagicraft did on his tiles. I'm going to be making a variety of these in the future, so I went with the thick beam look for now. Once done, bevel those edges with a ballpoint pen, cut thin strips from the edges, or you can just bevel those too for consistency. If you feel yourself flagging at any point, take a tea break. If anyone asks why you suddenly drink tea if you didn't before, tell them it was part of a tutorial by a British person. They'll understand. That said, finish your tea before starting the next bit, as it is a bit messy. Use your wire brush or sharp pencil to get a wood grain effect on the planks. I prefer wire brush personally, as I find it faster, and in my opinion it looks a little bit more realistic and less cartoony. This is totally personal preference. You can absolutely draw on your wood grain with a sharp pencil with this system. It's purely an aesthetic choice. When wire brushing the end pieces of these planks, I decided to stab them with the brush to make them look like the weather-worn ends of thick beams. As I mentioned in the foam section, I've picked up a fair few tricks that help get a better result from the wire brush effect. As I mentioned, you can make sure you're following the grain, but you can also stroke the pieces down before Mod Podging them to remove any foam dust that will clog up those grains. It's also a good idea not to gouge these grains too deeply, or the result can end up not looking like wood. I found that doing more, slower, lighter passes with the brush got more consistent and clean effects than doing fewer, heavier, faster passes. One final thing I would mention is that if you wear a dust mask while doing this, your lungs will probably thank you. I thought I'd also include an example of an optional technique you can use while wire brushing wood grain. You can vary the angle of your strokes between planks in order to get a less uniform effect. The unfortunate side effect of this is because it doesn't follow the surface grain of the foam, it often comes out looking far more ragged and less like wood grain than if you'd followed the grain straight up and down. Whether you choose to do this variation or not is up to you. I chose not to. I thought I'd mention it and some of the benefits and drawbacks and let you make your own decision. Next, measure out 1 inch from each side and punch in some nail holes with a cocktail stick, and then punch in some more about 1/8 of an inch from the edges. This is a neat little trick mentioned by Blackmagicraft to have a subtle grid on the planks. Not that I use a grid too often, but I know how some people like them, so I thought I'd include it. The next step is to make the tile connect to other pieces. The easiest way to do this I've already shown while making the tiles for my modular walls video, which I'll link in the description. Though that method is faster, it leaves this rim of card visible, which I wasn't perfectly happy about, so I fixed it. You can absolutely make these tiles using the old technique I mentioned in that video. This way it just gets you a better visual result and takes a little bit longer. To do it, cut out a 2.5 inch by 2.5 inch piece of chipboard. Then take your tile, flip it upside down, and measure 1 inch in the middle on every side on the bottom. It's important that this be in the middle. It doesn't matter if it's an exact inch from the edge, as your tile might be marginally thinner on one side. From there, connect all of these measurements in a cross and cut into the lines, aiming for about a 1/16 of an inch deep cut. Once you've done that, use an X-Acto knife to cut in from the edges, keeping the blade as straight as you can, and cut out these 4 chunks. If you're nervous, remember that it's better to cut off too little than too much, as you can trim it further quite easily. If you trim off a 1/4 inch on the other hand, that's a bit of a different matter. I find while doing later pieces here that it was much easier to cut under and snap off the first half of the chunk at a time, which made it far easier to not accidentally cut out too much or too deeply. It's also useful to have the chunks be beveled at the opening, as this makes it easier to get the tabs in. Doing this technique is easy enough to learn, but you might want to practice on some scrap foam until you get the knack for it. I messed up my first few and had to fix them with a little sculpted hot glue to fill up the gap again. Not ideal, but it does work in a pinch. Once you've cut the chunks down to a 1/16 of an inch deep, place your chipboard piece in the middle of the foam tile and draw around it, cutting the line by about 1/16 of an inch again. These corner sections are what's going to keep the card slightly raised up from the holes we carved, creating our slots. From there, the easiest way to dig out space for the card to rest neatly into is to use the back of a paintbrush to press the foam in slightly, compacting it right up to the edge of our lines and giving us the gap that we need to glue that card piece in. We can also use this same technique to push down the foam in the sections that we cut out further, so that the corner pieces are still raised up and will hold the chipboard up with enough of a gap at the edge for a card tab to slot in. I found that this was a safer method than simply cutting all the way down as I did the first time, as you can see here, as it gives you far more control. Cutting the chunk out is still important though, as the more you squash foam like this, the less bounce it has to hold a tab in place. I found that using a sculpting tool was also helpful in getting right up to the edges, but you can just as easily use a small kitchen knife. Glue the card piece in using tacky glue or hot glue. Hot glue is easier, but you do need to make sure that you compress the card strongly and make sure that that slot is still tight. This is another reason that squashing the foam is a bit easier, as it offers you that little bit more flexibility here. Either way, test the card slots using a chipboard tab that is slightly smaller than 1 inch by 2 inches, with the corners cut off to prevent them from fraying. If the card slot is too tight, use a cocktail stick to loosen it up. This is the reason it's better to be too tight than too loose. There's probably a joke in that somewhere. The tabs you make here are the best for connecting floor tile to floor tile. I'll show some more tabs later for connecting the walls, which are basically the same but half an inch shorter so that they don't poke out. You could absolutely make all of your tabs that length if you prefer that versatility. These longer ones are just a bit more stable for the floors. Finally, I did a lot of experimentation to find out the best methods that I could for painting wirebrush wood grain so that you can learn from my mistakes. You'll want to paint the whole thing in a mix of Mod Podge and dark brown paint. Mix enough paint in until you can't see the Mod Podge. You'll also want to thin this mixture about 50-50 with water for this step, as the wood grain doesn't react well to thick Mod Podge or thick paint. You'll want to be careful not to thin it any more than this. The mixture should still be thicker than water, about the same as if you were painting. When painting, try to paint a thick coat along the grain using a soft brush in slow strokes to allow the paint to sink into the recesses. Brush away any excess paint slowly at the end, and be careful not to let it settle thickly anywhere. Do a second coat with a smaller brush if needed to get into the cracks. Finally, I gave the whole thing a dry brush of that same brown paint mixed with tan. You'll want 2 parts tan to 1 part brown for a good, decently bright highlight. I didn't bother washing these pieces, as I really don't feel it offers much to this paint scheme, and it's also messy and time consuming, so I've left it out. Finally, you can seal it with the sealant of your choice. Either thinned down Mod Podge or a water-based spray sealant work great here. Obviously one is faster than the other, but one is more expensive. Neither are really better than the other, so pick the one that works best for you. If you are looking for a water-based spray sealant, I found some good stuff that's available in Europe, which is all linked to in my equipment list down below. If you want to make the simpler version of these tiles, just use the card connection system that I detail in my modular castle wall tutorial showing stone dungeon tiles. These are faster to make when you aren't as confident with this new method. To get started with a wall piece, grab a 2 inch by 3 inch by 1/4 inch piece of foam with the grain running along the short edge. Measure out 1/4 inch spaces along the top and bottom and cut shallow lines between them. You want to make sure these lines are 1/16 of an inch or 2 mm-ish deep at most, because this tile is thin and we want to add connection points later too. I found the easiest way to do this was to cut the lines with an X-Acto knife rather than a craft knife, which gave me a bit more control. Once you have those lines cut, bevel the edges using a ballpoint pen and add texture using your preferred method. You don't need to bevel and texture the top and bottom, that's just my OCD hitting overdrive. From here you can add those planks. Texture one side with your method of choice if you haven't done this earlier. If you haven't done this earlier and you're texturing them individually like me, use your fingers to gently bevel the edges of the planks before texturing. I discovered that this will help stop them from fraying. Once they're textured, attach a 1/2 inch plank to the bottom and a 1/4 inch plank about an inch above that. Basically the top of the 1/4 inch plank and the top of the 1/2 inch planks should be about an inch apart, and the gap between them should be roughly about 3/4 of an inch. You'll want these planks on both sides of the wall. Now we just need to add some connections, starting off with the card connection at the bottom. To do this, cut an 1.5 by 1/2 inch piece of chipboard. Then just take your wall, cut out an 1.5 inch from the centre of the bottom, about 1/16 of an inch deep. Then you can use the back of a paintbrush, like we did with the floor tiles, to squash the foam 1/16 of an inch deeper for the inch in the centre, being careful not to squash it too much. This will give you the space to glue the card in and a gap for a tab. Grab a floor tile tab and use it to check that the piece is tight enough before you glue the card in place with either hot glue or tacky glue. You'll need to make a different type of tab to use with the walls, basically the same as the floor tabs but 1/2 inch shorter. As this type of tab is visible on the outside, I also carve some wood grain into one side and paint it as I do the rest of the wood so it blends nicely. It's also worth doing this to the outside edges of the card on the bottom of the wall tiles if you can be bothered. It definitely makes the card blend in better. Now that the wall can connect to the floors, we need to add a few more connection points so it can connect to other walls as well as accessories. When pushing in the holes, it can help to measure a 1/4 inch onto the end of a cocktail stick. On mine I carved a thin line with a knife, so you might not be able to see it here, but it is there and it was bloody useful. For the wall connections, you'll want holes to be a 1/4 inch deep where possible. To connect the slots, you can use cocktail sticks just under a 1/2 inch in length, so they'll fit in on both sides. I found that they work best when you round off the end with a knife or sandpaper a little, so they fit in the slots without catching the edges or damaging them or widening them further. You'll want to push in 2 holes on both the top and the bottom, in the centre of the 3rd plank from the edge. These holes are to connect walls above and below each other. If you want, you can use 1/2 inch holes and inch-long cocktail sticks. These provide more stability, but foam is a bit finicky when you try and push things that far in, so you're best off pushing in a guidance hole with a sharp needle first if you want connections this long. Obviously, this isn't ideal for everyone as it takes more time, but I thought I'd mention it for those who want to use it. You could also try the 1/4 inch holes and then make them 1/2 inch holes later if you find that you want to. Push in 2 more holes on each side, a 1/2 inch from the ground and a 1/2 inch from the top, to connect walls and columns at the sides. If these holes ever get loose, and they can, you can tighten them up again by dabbing Mod Podge around the opening to grip the connection sticks better. As I mentioned, in future I'm tempted to revamp the system to use magnets for the wall and column connections, which is easy enough to do later as it just involves melting the hole wider with the tip of a glue gun and hot gluing the magnets in. For now though, I wanted to show that the system can work just fine with cocktail sticks. If you're finding this video useful, it would be awesome if you could like and subscribe or even share the video to help me reach more people like you. Anyway, back to the point. Finally, punch in 6 accessory slots on each side of the wall for maximum flexibility, as well as compatibility with a cool system I have in mind for the future as an expansion to these walls. I put them just above each plank, one at the centre in each place and an inch away on either side. Finally, seal and paint the wall as we did the floors, and then go back through your slots quickly with a cocktail stick and reopen slightly any that have sealed up a little due to the Mod Podge, and you're done. This might seem like a lot for a wall, but remember that you'll be able to use these as both interior spaces and exterior buildings, as well as combined with any other wall, floor, column or ceiling tiles that I show in future videos. The potential combinations are insane, and basically once built, you'll have your own advanced D&D Lego kit. Go nuts and get creative, I would really love to see what you guys can make with it. If you wanted to make the simple version of these walls, just make them 1/2 inch wide and don't do any of the cross beams. You can also choose to not do the accessory slots, which cuts down yet more time. Columns are extremely straightforward to make, to the extent that I don't really think you need a clip of me fiddling around making them. All you need to do is make 1/2 inch thick sticks, texture the edges, push in some holes to line up with the walls, so a 1/2 inch from the bottom and a 1/2 inch from the top, and then paint them. That's literally it. Because they're so damn easy to make, for the wood ones in particular, where the connection points are particularly obvious if you try to stack them, I decided to make a few different sizes for larger buildings like these stables. This is optional, you can absolutely just stack 2-inch columns together to make that height. However, I feel that they are so easy to make, and it looks, in the case of the wood columns at least, so much better because you're not seeing the connection points, that it's kind of worth spending an extra 5 minutes making a couple of extra columns that you could then use in other tall buildings as well. In this build I made 2 6.5 inch columns for the back and 2 4-inch columns for the front, but you could use 2 2-inch columns for the front and 3 2-inch columns for the back, which only leaves a small gap at the top of the back columns, but gives you a lot more flexibility. Like I said, columns aren't exactly that hard to make though, so you could just create individual columns for this piece and any other large buildings you intend to make with them in future. It's also worth making 4 or so 3-inch columns to fill the gap at the top of the back wall, and to attach to the back of the roof tiles, which adds a little bit more stability to them. For these columns, you'll want to punch the holes lined up with the holes on top of the walls instead of lined up with the holes at the side of the walls, so that you can connect them lying down. You can also use these 3-inch columns when using tiles to make more complex buildings with concave corners like this. A few 3-inch pillars allow you to slap them down between floor tiles to make up the gaps that these corners create. This is a quick, easy fix that gives a ton of flexibility while retaining the visuals of the system. You can even pin 2 of these together using their slots and use them as thin corridor pieces without walls for easier model placement, or pin 4 of them together and use them as standing columns in the middle of rooms. You can actually do this with the 2-inch columns too, which gives you even more corridor flexibility. The best part about this system for me is that you can make walls and columns in different materials and then combine them. So here's our wood walls with stone columns, for example. Stone columns are even better than wood because they hide the join between columns, which means you only ever need to make 2-inch and 3-inch ones, even for larger buildings. There's a lot of flexibility to be had from these diddy little pieces. The fences are a really flexible feature too. You can use them on the interior of the stables obviously, and rest them next to other fences rather than slotting them in to show gate piece. Combine them with some alternative clips that we can make for the outside, and they can serve a double purpose as exterior fences. As I mentioned again, I'll be showing some more modular pieces in future that this interior wall technique and tabs can work with for even more flexibility. To get started with each one, grab 4 1/4 inch by 1/16 of an inch wide balsa wood strips and cut them to 3 inches long, cutting strips from the edges to make them look worn. You only need to do this on one side of the bottom 2 strips, as they will be glued together. Kind of. Then grab 2 1/8 of an inch square balsa wood strips and cut them down to 1 inch each, cutting strips from the edge again to add that rough, worn feeling. You'll also need some 1/4 inch squares of serial card and some 2 inch by 3/4 inch strips of card for slotting them in. Once you have your pieces, lay out 3 strips and tacky glue them to your posts one at a time, being careful to keep things straight and try and keep the glue off the front of the wood where possible, as it tends to interfere with any painting that you do later. I found it was easiest to glue the bottom one lined up with the bottom of the posts, and then the top slightly below the top of the posts, and then finally glue the middle plank somewhere in between. This is a lot easier if you have a grid that you can place underneath while you're gluing like this that allows you to keep the 90-degree angles exactly the way you would want them to be. Once that's done, glue in your 2 serial card squares into the bottom plank in the corner. While that's drying, cut down the final plank to fit just between the posts and then tacky glue it in place to the 1/4 inch card pieces in the corner, leaving the space in the middle open as our slot. I also used a sculpting tool, though any sharp object would do, to punch in some nail holes in the fence just to add that extra layer of detail. I found later that this got filled up a little by Mod Podge, so you'll want to widen the hole a little with a cocktail stick too. Or you can probably just do it straight with a cocktail stick. Balsa wood is pretty pliable. From there, you can just paint it as we have the rest of the wood. I would advise using thinned down paint for this, as the thicker the paint you use, the more this wood grain is going to be clogged up and covered. So multiple thin layers here are better. Then we just need to take our piece of card that we're going to use for the tab and cut a 1/4 inch by 1 inch piece from the middle of the bottom. This is to allow the floor tile card slot to fit between it. Then just cut the corners of the top and bottom to help avoid fraying, and your fence and tab are ready to install. If you want the fence to be usable outside, you'll need to make a second tab with a little mud base like this. I used a 2 inch by 3/4 inch strip of card, folded it in half along the long edge before slotting it into a 1/8 of an inch thick piece of foam, much like we used for the hay floors, which I textured and painted similarly with a few grass tufts for flavour. To put it together, I just cut a 2 inch line in the centre and slotted the card in from below. It was worth indenting the foam at the bottom a little with a paintbrush to allow the serial card to fit under and allow the foam to sit smooth with the floor. The shape of the foam is pretty important too. Cutting the corners like this at a 45-degree angle allowed the piece to sit at a 90-degree angle with other fences easily while remaining stable. Pun slightly intended. Now, the roof tiles are what really separates this build from other DIY dungeon tiles, in that, much like Dwarven Forge, they allow you to build whole modular towns or even cities from simple modular pieces. That said, remember these pieces are optional, and you can still do a lot with this system using just the floors, walls, columns and accessories. These roof tiles work on a fairly straightforward connection system. Each ceiling has 2 end pieces, which look like angled walls with a roof beam on top. These connect to roof tiles, which more or less mirror the floor tiles in size. This gets around a big problem with roof pieces in that the middle pieces need to be less wide than the bit that rests on the walls at the edge. I haven't made a template for these roof edge beams, partially because you don't really need one, but mainly because I was running out of time in the month. If I do get a message from one of my patrons asking for one, I will do my best to put one together as soon as possible as another thank you. To get started, grab a piece of 2 inch by 3 inch by 1/4 inch foam like we used for the walls and cut and texture it in exactly the same way. Once we have that, put a steel ruler from corner to corner and carefully cut the piece in half, trying to keep the angle of the cut as close to the corners as possible. This cuts our one wall piece into 2 and halves the workload here. From there, grab some 1/2 inch beams of foam that you've cut to at least 5 inches long. Bevel the edges with your fingers and texture it as wood before gluing to the top of your wall piece, making sure that the highest point of the beam has enough sticking over to cut it straight with the wall, and that the wall is in the centre underneath the beam. Once you have that, cut the beam straight with the rest of the wall. Then measure a 1/2 inch outwards at the bottom into the overhanging foam and cut a chunk out carefully at a 90-degree angle. This is so it can overhang the column. Finally, cut the end of the piece at a 90-degree angle about a 1/4 inch past the column when measuring the bottom of the beam. This is to make sure it lines up with the other ceiling tiles. It's a good idea to add the connection slots at this point. In addition to putting slots on the bottom and side exactly as you would do with the walls, it also needs a special slot in the beam to connect the roof pieces to. To make these slots, measure and cut an 1.5 inch slit in the middle of the inner edge, just over a 1/4 inch deep, being careful not to punch right through. It's very important that these slits be level with the beam or your roof will be a little wonky. A good way to measure where to cut the slit is to follow the middle 4 planks of the wall to the top. The slit should sit over all of them. Once you have that, use a cocktail stick, blunt knife or sculpting tool to widen the hole until a card tab will slot in. Use a floor tab for roof-to-roof connections or a wall tab for roof-to-edge piece connections. You can just use wall tabs for everything, it's just a little flimsier. That's the framework more or less complete, just paint it as we have all of the other wood. This piece is very flexible as it can be used with both the thatch tiles I'm making today as well as other tiles that I make in future. As roof frames are often made of wood, even on buildings made of other materials, it won't even look out of place if you use it with something other than these wood walls either. That said, I'll probably end up making some stone or other variants too, because I'm obsessive. Mention it in the comments if you'd actually like to see these, and I'll do a tutorial at some point. The main roof tiles are where we add texture. I've spent ages in the past looking for a good method for thatch roofs, and I've never been satisfied until I came across this one, though for the life of me, I can't remember where I saw it. If anyone recognises it and can link me a source in the comments, I'll make a pinned comment about it, because whoever came up with this deserves some recognition. The method itself is really quite quick and straightforward, far more so than other methods of using this particular material, so don't let that put you off. If you do really feel that you lack the time for this, check out the simple version at the end, because that is still quite a lot faster. I should also be covering how to add tiles to roofs like this in a future video, so if you'd like to do a stable with a tiled roof, that will be possible. To get started, you'll need some jute twine, which you'll often find in garden centres or the plant section of home or hobby stores. You can use hemp, but I've found that jute both looks better as hay or straw, and also seems to untangle a lot easier. You'll also need a piece of 2-inch thick card cut to about 10 inches long to act as a framework to wrap this stuff around. Start by hot gluing the end of your twine to the card and wrapping the twine around it until it covers the whole card before hot gluing it at the end. Take the hot glue gun and glue a 1/2 inch line along the middle of the card, flattening it with the glue gun nozzle as you go so it takes up less vertical space. Once that's dried, turn it over and cut the twine in the centre of the card, and cut the end pieces loose from the card too. This should give you loose twine on each side, but secured together in the middle by the hot glue. I tend to do a layer of hot glue on the other side too, flattening it down again just so that I can be as rough as I like in the next stage. I also make sure that the ends are sealed with a little bit more hot glue. The next step is to take a normal hair comb like this and use the larger section to disentangle the main threads by brushing, and the fine tooth section to disentangle the finer threads from there. As anyone who has brushed knots out of hair will tell you, this is easier if you start at the bottom and work your way up. If this looks awkward, that's because when doing it on a desk on camera like this, it kind of is. The best way to do this that I found was to rest the twine on your leg and push the comb down and through, using your leg to press against and hold the twine in place. You will absolutely get loose strands knotted in your comb. Don't worry, just pull them loose and keep going. This is only a problem if the twine ends up too thin, which is pretty unlikely. Save the loose twine though, it's going to come in very useful later. Once you've done your best impression of a child combing a doll's hair and your twine is mostly straight, if you're happy with it, you can move on to the next stage. Cut the piece right down the middle of the hot glue and make sure that the hot glued area is still about a 1/4 inch thick on each side. Then cut it into 3-inch strips. You'll need 5 pieces like this for each roof tile. The spare one comes in useful either for making more or in case you accidentally mess one up. It's worth adding a little hot glue to the ends and back of each piece too at this point, just to keep them sealed. After this, if you want to make it a little easier, you can use bobby pins to pin the twine in a straightened position overnight, which can help make sure that it stays where it's told when you take the pins out and glue it in place. Now that we have that, we need a roof piece to layer it over. To make this, measure your end pieces from top to bottom and cut out some 1/2 inch foam 3 inches wide and then however long your beams are. You'll want the grain here to be running along the 3-inch side to make it easier to do the wood grains. This isn't crucial, as I mentioned before. I messed one up here and cut into the wrong side. All it will affect is how good the wood grains look up close. Use the edge pieces as a template again to cut a groove into the underside that lines up with the column groove on the edge piece. This is to allow a wall to fit beneath in any future setups. Don't worry if you're not sure how deep to make it. If you make it too shallow to be on the safe side, you can always trim more later. You'll also need to cut the end of the roof to the same angle at the top of the side piece using the same technique. Here it's most important to make sure you don't cut any length off the piece when cutting the corner. It's better to undercut and clean it up. Don't worry if you overcut on the underside as much, as this will practically be hidden. Once you have that, first make connection slots for card tabs in the long sides, much as we did for the edge pieces. If you want to know exactly where to cut, try cutting down some cocktail sticks so that they just poke out of your edge piece, and then line it up with your ceiling tile. If you let the cocktail sticks poke 2 small holes and then cut from there, you should be able to get a perfectly lined up slot. Again, the most important thing is getting these cut at a proper angle, if at all possible, lined up with the beam. We want these slots to be just over 1 inch deep on the full wall tiles, so you can use the wall tabs to connect ceilings to edges and floor tabs to connect ceilings to other ceilings. Before connecting our thatch, we'll need to get some wood grain on the top and bottom. Cut and bevel a 1/2 inch line at the top and bottom and texture them as wood. You can optionally also texture the sides and bottom as wood in case you ever display them due to battle damage or something. As a final texturing step, measure inch spaces from the edges of the piece, making a light cut line and indent these areas slightly with the back of your comb or a paintbrush. Be careful not to push too hard when doing this over the top of the card slots so you don't break them. These will allow our hot glued twine pieces to fit in and overlap nicely. If you're super paranoid about being able to see through, you can also lightly texture the top as wood. Paint the wood as we did everything else and attach your twine pieces. Trim the loose ends to 1.5 inches long with a knife or scissors, and then snip angled cuts in the ends to make sure that the cut doesn't look too perfectly straight. Then just hot glue them in place with the grooves that we beveled earlier. The bottom piece should overhang, and the top piece needs some special treatment. When you get to the top, coat the area in hot glue and lay the twine on top, covering the top of the thatch piece below, which should leave the hot glued edges of the top piece overhanging at the back. At this point, you'll want to spray seal the roof and cut the hot glued ends off, which is easiest with a knife and should help keep the twine in place, though test your spray brand on a spare piece though. If you don't have spray sealant, don't worry too much. Theoretically, you could use spray adhesive, though I'm not sure how well this would work. Alternatively, you can just not use any kind of spray and rely on the next stage to hold the twine pieces in place at the top. You will occasionally get loose pieces of twine probably compared to using the spray sealant, but it should still work. We then need to add some new glue in the form of some thinned down Mod Podge at the very top. This will obviously clump up the twine, but at the top this is less of an issue as it can look like the thatch has simply been pinned down more thoroughly here. Finally, I'll mention that when placing these on the stables, you might notice that there's a half-inch gap at the back of the wall. This is because this building is an unusual shape, and I didn't want to design the building system entirely around it. It's easily counted though, with some 3-inch column pieces to fill the gap which I mentioned earlier. You can easily poke some holes in the back of the ceiling tiles that should line up with the wall holes of the columns. You can measure this much like we did the edge pieces and ceiling pieces by lining them up next to each other and using the cocktail stick method. For the simple roof version, just texture the foam top of the roof tile as half-inch wood planks. It's important to remember though that these pieces will see use again and again as a part of a range of different buildings, so measure how much time you're happy to spend on it accordingly. Now we've got the structure pieces built, making this build feel more like a stable is the job of the accessories. I'm going to start with the accessories that are both easy and add to the feel of a stable the most, and go on to those which are more complex and optional. The hay floor is the easiest place to start. All you need is a piece of 3-inch by 3-inch XPS foam cut to a 1/16 of an inch thick. Texture it as you would stone using tinfoil, as I've kind of found that this technique also works incredibly well as an earth or dirt texture. Make sure you push the foam down at the edges until it's as smooth with the floor as you can get it. Then just paint with a mix of Mod Podge and dark brown paint. Keep the layer thin and use a dry brush to grab any excess paint podge from the surface, which will help it warp less. Then just leave it to dry with a heavy-ish tool on top. Though the tool may stick to the piece, this is easy to quickly cover with a little bit of paint. Warping is a much harder problem to fix. Once dried, grab some of that brushed off twine that I said to keep from earlier and take some clumps and spread them out a little until you could see through them if you flattened them. Then flatten them. Give them a few snips with scissors to break up the long threads and spread them out a little bit more to make it look nice and random. Then Mod Podge the dirt in a thin layer and apply your flat twine to the tile before sealing with spray sealant again. That last stage isn't crucial, it just helps stop the piece from shedding a little bit more. You can also choose to trim any excess twine from the edges if you prefer it to look that way. And now we have a nice quick accessory for our stables, which can also be used in any animal pens or even as scatter terrain in a farming or primitive area. The hay pile follows a similar procedure, except this time we want to add a little optional feature that we can play with. Cut, texture and paint a piece of XPS just as you did for the hay floor, but this time make it more rounded. Grab those clumps of twine again and make small clumps. Cut random snips in the clumps and shuffle them a little as we did for the hay pile, but don't flatten them. What we want to do with them is place them in a circle around the edge of the dirt tile, reasonably thickly so that you can't see through, and glue them down with Mod Podge. Once the pile is about an inch high and you can't see through it, spray seal it and grab some more twine. You can make as many of these as you want, with or without these ambush holes, as you should have plenty of leftover combed twine, and these make good town, village or farm scatter terrain. With this twine we want to make a sort of rounded cone / dome shape that will fit over the top, but is ideally slightly hollow underneath, enough to fit the top half of a mini inn. We can do this by building this rounded cone of hay and poking an indent in the underside, making sure it fits the top of the lower hay pile. Spray it with your spray sealant, and now you can place it on top of the hay pile, hiding whatever ambushing mini you'd like to place inside. Or you could put a terrified child in there that you only reveal to the party after the fight and have the wizard be very relieved he didn't recklessly cast Fireball. The trough is a nice little piece that is really easy to make and adds a lot to the scene. All you need is some 1/4 inch by 1/16 of an inch balsa wood strips, cut 3 of them down to 2 inches in length, and then cut 2 more pieces which are about 1/4 inch in length for the ends. Glue them together, trim the edges to make it look a little bit worn, and trim any excess from the top of the edges. You then only need to paint most of it like wood, with no added Mod Podge, remembering to thin down your paint a little bit, as thin paint makes sure that as much of the balsa wood grain survives as possible. Then just paint the bottom black, and thickly dab some gloss Mod Podge over it. Be careful with the gloss Mod Podge. You'll want to aim to avoid getting bubbles. You could use 2-part resin instead to fill these troughs, though whether that's worth the expense is up to you. It might be something you could do while using the resin for something else though. The final hairpiece is awesome and one of my favourites, but is totally optional. It's a little more involved than the last two and not totally required to get the feel of a stable. But it is cool and does add a lot to the finished setup, as well as being usable in other places such as the side of a peasant's home, outside a tavern, and so on. To make it, I used the cheapest damn crafting material on the planet, matchsticks. You can grab a huge bag for a few quid, so it's worth having one lying around. I started by building the back frame that would attach to the wall, using a 1 3/4 inch piece of balsa wood, and tacky glued 5 3/4 inch matchsticks to one side, measuring them up against a full matchstick, which I then glued to the bottom to stabilise it. From there I trimmed away any excess balsa wood. I then cut 5 more 3/4 inch long matchsticks, cutting the ends at a 45-degree angle, which the cutting mat here was extremely useful for, and attached each in turn to the bottom of the first 5 sticks, along with a full matchstick to stabilise them. It's important when gluing these to make sure that they're all fitted at the same angle. Trim any that are out of line down, or use gel superglue to fill gaps where you've cut away too much. I used 2 methods here, one where I attached them all to the main piece first, and one where I attached the edge 2 sticks to both sides first to get the right angle, and then glued the other middle pieces in after. Both work, but I think the second method is less fiddly. Unfortunately, my phone camera is less than reliable and cut off recording of the second method, so I can't show you it visually. Ask in the comments if you have any questions about it though. From there I cut 2 more sticks to fit the edges, which I then trimmed to match the angles once glued in place. I also cut 2 cocktail sticks at a 45-degree angle and glued them to the back an inch apart. If you check out my video on modular accessories, you'll find more guidance on how to make sure that these pieces fit in my accessory slots. Finally, I painted the piece like all of the other wood and stuffed in some twine for hair, sealing it in place with spray sealant. A neat little accessory you can do with very little effort is this little rope hung on a nail in the wall. The nail is just the cocktail stick connection piece, Mod Podged and painted silver, while the rope is just some string stained with a 2-to-1 mix of water to brown wash. I used Soft Tone by Army Painter to make a little more rope coloured. I then just sealed it in place with a few thin layers of Mod Podge mixed with water. It's a nice little wall accessory that means a completely different thing when you see it in a stable to when you see it on the wall of the slave prison in an orc-held dungeon. Much as I would love to show a tutorial for this crate, a combination of the coronavirus lockdown and literally running out of time has meant that I couldn't get it recorded. I'll probably include it in a future video though, so just keep an eye out for it. To finish the video up, I thought I'd include some explanation of the various setups that I've probably been showing off photos of throughout this video, and mention clearly how many of each piece you'll need to achieve them. There are a range of scenarios that you can run when the characters arrive or leave at stables, from ambushes and assassinations to full-scale village invasions or escaping from a besieged city like Ciri in The Witcher. I'll start with the big one, the large stables set against some city walls. To make this size of stable, including all of the accessories and so on, you will need 8 floors, 16 walls, 4 ceilings, 2 ceiling edges, and either 2 4-inch columns for the front and 2 6.5-inch columns for the back, or 10 2-inch columns that you can stack instead. Accessory wise, you'll need 6 fences, 3 hay floors, 3 hay feeders, 3 troughs, 2 hanging ropes, and a hay pile. The walls are made using the pieces from my previous build, the wall and temple system. I've just stacked walls to double height, which makes them far more imposing and reminds me of the feeling of being behind the walls of Novigrad in The Witcher 3, proper city-scale walls. Anyway, to make those you'll need 24 stair pieces, 6 floor tiles, and 6 battlement pieces, which obviously you can also use for a ton of other things, so check out that video if you're interested. This build is a solid size and great for impressing the importance of collateral damage on your players, as it's easier to run a fight within the building because there's more space to play with. Yes, the assassin did just leap up from the hay pile, but this building is made of wood and straw, and there are children here, Mr. Wizard. Put the fireball down and step away from the bad decision. The second build sets a similar but noticeably different scene. This time the stables are smaller and the wall is shorter, which pulls together for a much less imposing feel, but one that would match a small town or fortified settlement. The pieces you need for this build are basically the same as the first, but with a few less pieces as we've pretty much just removed a stable section. The wall is also easier here, as you'll need half the stair pieces to build it. Another build you can use, which works well if the stable is in the middle of a town or village, is the double-sided stables. This build uses pretty much the same pieces as the first build, but requires 2 more roof edge pieces and 2 more 4-inch columns for the second front. This one makes good scatter terrain for a village or town, and a great backdrop to an urban fight scene. If these seem like a lot to build for your lifestyle, don't forget you can do any of these builds without roofs, or with the simple version of the pieces as I describe in the tutorial section. This can speed up building dramatically. Another cool little build you can do with the pieces is use them for a much smaller scale building, like this animal shed and pen. This build works great placed next to some peasant cottages or farm fields, and adds a lot of flavour and interesting difficult terrain like fences and loose animals to a fight scene. This is probably the smallest full build, and to do it you only need 4 walls, 2 ceilings, 2 ceiling edges and 6 fences, along with 2 hay floors, a hay feeder and a trough as accessories. If you want to pick up some cheap-ish farm animals as scatter terrain, Warlord Games does a good set which I've used here. Not a sponsor or anything, I just thought the kit was decent for a tenner or so I'll link it in the description below. Last but not least, you can of course use these pieces as almost any other wood building, either as the interior or as the exterior. I plan on expanding the system in future videos with windows and doors, but even as it is, you can easily show large interior spaces with columns. These work great to represent taverns, warehouses, town halls, merchant guilds, coaching inns, pretty much anything that you would use wood dungeon tiles for, except these have that added atmosphere of walls and accessories. Torches currently look a little out of place in a wood building, so I'm planning on making some wall candle holders for the future, along with a range of other indoor accessories. There are a few advantages to using the walls from this system, rather than, for example, walls built into the tile, as seem to be more common in sets like Dwarven Forge. First and foremost, this system is far easier to store, as it's all completely flat and stacks really well. Perfect for whether you are storage limited or just want more space for even more terrain. Another useful feature is that unlike fixed walls, these walls can be slightly moved outwards to accommodate larger minis or bases without removing them entirely, or without moving the actual floor, creating a gap. It's also much harder to run out of corners and still have walls, or have too many corners and not enough walls. All walls are corners and all corners are walls in this system. The walls are also removable without removing the tiles, which means you can pull some off to give your players a cutaway view when needed and replace them when not. This has been an amazing project to work on. It took me far longer than it should take you, as I had to prototype and rework issues as I went, but it has absolutely been worth it. I hope this tutorial is helpful to you all, and I hope your tables get a lot of use out of it. That's all from me for now. Until next time, I'll be in the archive.